Alright guys, what I'm going to try to do is narrate you through a couple of things here. We're going to start with an opening. So the opening ideas that we're going to talk about are just trying to gain space and what to and what not to do. So it's good to open in the center of the board. So this was e4, e5. The white king's pawn moved out first and the black's king pawn matched. What I want you to see here is with the knights. So we have a knight f3 and then we have a knight c6. The knights on opposite ends like that, they are the ones that counter each other. So the knight on c6 came out to counter what the knight on f3 was doing. So the white knight came out first and then the black knight came out. Now we're going to develop the bishop. So a good idea here is to get your minor pieces out as fast as possible. So knights first, then bishops, because knights can come out faster than bishops. And prepare for castling. So black now has both of his knights out. White has a knight and a bishop out. White's ready to castle because he's moved his king side first. So that's king side before queen side. Now I'm playing both of these. So, and ultimately black ends up winning this game the way I played it. But I highlighted that in because the bishop is aiming at that pawn down there. The pawn next to the king is the weakest pawn. The pawn on the king's shoulder away from the queen is the weakest pawn on the board because the king is the only defender. So when we castle, we bring the rook over and help to defend our king here. So now black's going to try to get castled too. And just to do something a little different, I didn't move the bishop quite as far instead of mirroring. It's okay and probably a good idea to mirror the white bishop here, but this is fine too. One thing that I'm looking at is that there's no defense on that E pawn for white, so the black knight could just take it, and so it's worth defending. When white came out with his knight on f3, he was immediately countered by the black knight on c6, and so the black knight on f6 needs to be countered by something. Either by pushing the pawn here, the d pawn up one to protect that pawn, that e pawn, the pawn that's sitting there under attack by the knight, or by bringing out the knight to c3 to counter the f knight. This is also something that might have been worth paying attention to a little bit earlier too. You'd have to back it up and take a look to see if that pawn got left unprotected for a minute. Sometimes a pawn looks unprotected and it actually isn't. It'll look like there's nothing there, but there might be a discovery attack penetrating through by moving the rook over. Something you'll see in the what not to do section, kind of. The game moves a little too fast there. So we're going to try to get these bishops out of the way now. So we're going to fianchetto. It's called fianchettoing the bishop. So on both sides, we'll push the b pawn, and white will move their dark square bishop into b2, and black will move his light square bishop into b7. And in both of these cases, we're just going to be tucking the bishops away, and all that'll be left is to get those queens off the back to connect the rooks, and we'll have finished development. So the basic idea is to get your pawns out, control the center, develop your knights, develop your bishops, get your rooks connected, and get your kings safe. That's the idea of the opening, the first 10 moves or so. Get your king to safety, get those rooks connected. Don't try to lift the rooks out on their own. Don't move those edge pawns to get the rooks out. Move your center pawns. Alright, so here's a what not to do. A huge amount of knowledge or opening theory has built up around the openings. Many players have a favorite opening system, and books on openings are very popular. There's tons and tons of books about opening and opening theory. So this is what not to do. A good tip is not to bring the queen and rooks out into the game too early. You might be giving a target to your opponent's minor pieces. Watch the following sequence of moves as an example of how things can go wrong if you do not follow solid principles. While white is taking pieces, the white queen eventually gets pinned, a complete disaster, all because of white's terrible opening development. So we've talked about moving your pawns out into the center to gain center control. That's fine. This is not. Getting that queen out there too fast. Black does the right thing and just develops his knight. So knights are developed now. Now the queen's under attack. She's got to move. So white's losing time. Now the bishop's x-ray through that knight. White made another bad move by putting his knight on the rim. Alright. Now the queen's under attack again. So she's got to move again. Alright. So now black is already castled. And white's just getting greedy. Right? Things like this. And now it's going to pretend like white won, but they didn't. So if you remember the position, if you look, the queen is directly in front of the king. All that's going to happen is black's rook is going to slide over to the E8 square directly in front of that queen and be hitting the queen. She can't get out of the way because she's pinned to the king, and her only choice is to take the rook and then die to the black queen. So white loses his queen for a rook, and when we see evaluation of pieces, you'll see that that's a bad thing. Alright, so here is an opening, a real opening. They call it the Borin Opening. Don't be fooled by the title. This is an excellent opening for amateur players who do not know a lot of chess theory or have limited time to study. It is easy to learn and at the same time solid and aggressive play that keeps black from getting his development. I didn't get red in time. White's opening move is d4, so it says play that now, so we'll do that. That's the pawn in front of the queen. Black will often reply with what is known as the king's Indian defense and play knight f6. Now this isn't necessary for black, so understand black could also play d5 and some other lines, but if he does, you have knight f3 here. Now he played g6, so you could follow up by playing bishop to f4. Notice we've developed knight, we've developed a bishop, or we're about to develop the bishop. And we're just going to move it over here to f4. And they move the bishop into the fianchetto position on g7. And then just by moving e3, helping to support that pawn, you've now completed this opening. Although you do still need to get your other knight and other bishop out and castle. So I wouldn't call that a completed opening, but it's along the way. So here's a game that I actually played online on Chess Ultra. So I opened with d4, and my opponent is rated 1045, so he's quite a bit below me, so he's going to make some mistakes here, but that's a good thing for you guys to look. This move right here is called e6. It's not a terrible move. It's not a blunder by any stretch of the imagination, but what it is a little passive. Remember, we want to get the pawns out and control the center of the board, and so by moving that pawn like he did, he really didn't fight for center control, so he's going to give that to me. When you play d4, you're looking for c4 pretty soon most of the time, and since he didn't play d5 to challenge it, I'm going to play it right away. I would have anyway. Alright, so this is a blunder, a mistake. So this is breaking that rule. The queen's coming out too early, so he plays queen f6. This is going to give me a target, so I want to get my knight out right away so I can start swinging my bishop over there to g5 and attacking. I can't send the bishop there now. It has to be defended. But by moving my knight, I defend the g5 square. So I move knight f3 to defend the g5 square for when I put the bishop there to harass that queen. Every time I harass the queen, I want to be developing a piece and forcing him to waste time moving his queen. One of the features of chess is something called tempo. Tempo is another way of saying time. Alright, so he's going to take a move here to put me in check. So this bishop b4 move is a check, so I've got to deal with the check. If I interpose with my bishop on d2, then I take away that attack I was looking to do on the queen. So I'll interpose with my knight on c3 instead. It's supported by the pawn, so if the bishop takes, it's just a exchange there. So let's take a new look at this. And now he makes another mistake. So this knight is developed, that's fine. But one of our ideas, remember our principles, fight for the center. So we want to move those central pawns. We want to make fight for the center. He's not doing that. We have a saying that goes, a knight on the rim is dim. This knight in the center could be fighting for as many as 8 squares. But the queen is taking his favorite spot on f6. So by going to h6, he's limited to his home square of g8, then f7 right there by his own king, then f5, which is already protected by the pawn, and g4. So he's really only fighting for 1 square, since his pawn is already holding the other forward square, and then the other 2 are in his own camp. So he really isn't doing anything there. As long as he stays there, he's not really a piece I'm worried about. So that's the kind of mistake that was made there. Alright, so these are just opening mistakes that my opponent is making, which kind of goes into the theme of what I want. Now, I could have taken the knight, but then the queen would just take my bishop back, and I'm giving up a decent bishop for, again, a not so good knight. So I'm just going to do bishop to g5 here, attacking that queen. So the queen's going to move, and there's really only 2 options. Either g6 right in front of the bishop, or f5 right beside the bishop. Okay, so now I want to see if I can't harass that queen a little bit more. So we're going to see if we can't develop our light square bishop and hit the queen again. When he made this move, though, I was thinking he was going to try to swing his queen over to a5, which is all the way over here on the other side, but diagonally behind his bishop that's attacking my knight. If he does that, then I have to move my queen to c2, which is right underneath the knight there, and help defend the knight. But he's about to make a move here. So I played e3. I'm trying to release my bishop so I can get my development complete. Notice that I've got 2 knights and a bishop out in the game. He's got a bishop, a queen, and half a knight, basically. So he played b7. So he tells me that he played b6. So he tells me with that move that he's going to put his bishop on b7. And that tells me something about where I think his queen is going to go. So I'm going to play bishop to d3, attacking his queen. And I feel confident that the queen is going to go to g4. So he'll play queen g4 because of the fianchetto with the bishop. It kind of told me he wants to attack down on this king side. The king side is the side of the board where the kings are. So as we're looking at it, basically the right hand side. So he does play queen g4. And now I have some options. Or some things to think about. The queen on g4 is attacking my g2 pawn, and that pawn is undefended. If I push my h pawn to further attack his queen, so if I push h3, his queen will just take my g2 pawn. If I try moving my knight, his queen could take the bishop or the g2 pawn. If I try to castle, then my castle puts my king right under his queen. So my king will be on g1 with his queen sitting on g4. Once he fianchettos that bishop on b7, he's x-raying through my knight. If that knight ever leaves, there's a checkmate attack that he would have on b7. On g2 with the bishop on b7 and the queen on g4 attacking g2 right away. So I don't want to put my king under that kind of danger, but I do want to defend that pawn. But the pawn is also helping to defend the knight. So I'm just going to slide the rook over to g1 and start thinking about castling the other way. I do want to get castled if I can, but right now I've got other concerns. I would have castled kingside here if that queen wasn't sitting there staring at g2 and creating those sorts of problems for me. So like I said, what I'm going to play here once it reaches that point is rook to g1. And there it is. So that was just because I thought that castling would create mate problems for me, possible mate threats down the road. So the bishop was played. Now I can play h3 attacking the queen, and he only has one square, and that's h5. I cannot play g4, continuing to push the attack, because then the queen can come down and take my h3 pawn because the rook is no longer protecting it. So I have to be aware of that particular problem. Also, if it's his move right now and he plays bishop takes knight on f3, and then I play queen takes knight on f3, he can do queen takes bishop on g5. But if you look, now that his bishop's been taken, I then have queen takes his rook on a8, and then he's got to castle or lose his knight as well. So he really doesn't want to initiate that attack, because I end up picking up a rook for a bishop. And as you'll learn a little bit later, a rook is a little more powerful than a bishop overall, and so you'd rather not give that up. So I'm going to play the bishop back. I kind of underestimated how good that situation was for me, but I also saw this hanging pawn on c7. So if you look all the way down to c7, I'm looking directly at a pawn I can just take. And I want to see how he wants to handle that situation. So I'm just giving him a threat to deal with. And he doesn't. He actually blunders here. So by pushing the pawn all the way up, at the very opening, that's a good move. That d5 move is fine. But now that he played d5 with my bishop where it's at and his bishop where it's at, he has cut off his own bishop. His bishop was applying pressure to my knight, so his bishop was his best piece. Now he's cut it off, and he left that pawn undefended, so I'm just going to take it. So bishop takes c7. Now I'm attacking his knight, which is not really a problem, because the bishop and knight are worth about the same amount. So he moves his knight to h6. I'm not worried about him taking my bishop, because I can always pick it back up. If it was his move and he played knight takes c7, I would just play queen to a4 check, and then after he does whatever he's going to do to get out of that, I just do queen takes b4, so I pick up his bishop for mine. But I have another idea. He has a pawn chain from f7, e6, and d5. That pawn chain would be nice to disrupt. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my bishop in such a way as to lure his f-pawn forward and create a weakness on his or for his e-pawn. So if I can move my bishop in such a way as to bring that f-pawn forward, when he pushes it forward, that e-pawn becomes what we call a backwards pawn. So the e-pawn is the one right in front of the king. So I'm going to put my bishop on e5 and hope that he's going to play something like f6. If he plays f6, then I can put my bishop right back where it was. And I told you before, if his knight takes my bishop, I pick up his other bishop. And then his e-pawn is backwards, and there's not a whole lot he can do about it. And then I can pick on it. So that's kind of what's gonna happen here. I'm hoping that you guys will be able to hear all this and make sense out of it. And if you have questions for Mrs. Barber, just let her know. I'm sure she'll write them down and bring them to me. And I'm hoping also that you'll understand what all these little notation things mean. If you don't, there's a notation section at the end of this video, and once you understand that and you come back, you might see it a little better. But there's notation on the screen that you can see. And he did play f6. And if you just watch where the pieces actually go, you'll kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about. So I'm going to play bishop back to c7. So that's bishop to c7. And he's going to play knight takes c7. And then we're going to do that thing I talked about. So we're going to play queen a4 rather. And that'll be check. Alright, so queen a4 check. So he's got to do something about that. So he's either got to move his king, or he's got to push his pawn, or move his knight in the way. If he moves his knight in the way, I take his knight, keep the check, and still get the bishop. If he pushes his pawn, I can't take the pawn, and I'm talking about the b pawn. I can't take the pawn because the knight will be protecting it, but I can still take the bishop. This is probably the weakest square for his king, that one, or the e7 square, because I'm going to take with check now. So when I do queen takes b4, that's check. because my queen's still attacking his king. And now he plays king f7. So I'm just going to send my queen into his camp. It's a little dangerous, but there's plenty of room for her to move around, so I'm not too worried. So I've got my queen in his camp now, and she is on d6, attacking the knight. Now, what I think is best here is for him to play his h-rook, the one all the way on the right-hand corner as you're looking at it, the one underneath the queen, the knight, and the pawn. Play that h-rook all the way over to c8 to hold the knight. That's what I think is best. And the reason I say that is because if he brings the other rook, he kind of cuts himself off a little bit. I don't know that it's bad to play the a rook. I mean, I don't see a problem with playing the a rook either. But this one is a mistake. So the rook a to d8 is a mistake because it's going to give up the knight with check. So I'm just going to play queen takes c7, and that's check. And I'm also going to end up winning that bishop. Again, I could be wrong about playing the h-rook instead of the a-rook, but I'm definitely right that he should have played to c8 instead of d8. So this is check, and he has two real choices. He can play the king to g6, which I can understand not wanting to do that because that feels dangerous, getting the king out into a kind of a bad traffic area. So his other option is king to e8, and he's protecting his rook that way. So I'll just play queen takes b7. Now he's attacking my queen by playing rook d7. So when I move my queen, I want to kind of attack his rook at the same time as his king. So I'm just going to move her to c8, and this gives him fewer good choices. So if he moves his king in the wrong direction, I can take that d7 rook with check. But if he stays close and moves up one, I can take his h8 rook. He can also move his d7 rook back to d8 to block my queen. If he does that, now that hanging pawn becomes a problem, or that backwards pawn becomes a problem, because now it's hanging. It would be queen takes e6 check, but since he moved the king, I'm just going to take the h8 rook. So he went king e7, so queen takes h8. Now if he's going to do anything, I think moving the queen back to f7 is best to hold the pawn and see if you can come back later to trap the queen. But I think he's going to try this too early. This should be a move later. So he plays rook d8. So I'm just going to play queen takes g7 check. And now he plays queen, but that queen f7, but that just gives me the knight for free, so I'll take it. So I'm playing queen takes h6. Now this is a move that happens early in this in a d4 opening, where it's the d5 pawn takes the c4 pawn. So that's not a problem for me at all. It's something that I was expecting a long time ago. So I'm just going to play bishop takes c4, and this next move by him is just a blunder. Alright, so he plays, and he just exposes his queen. She's just dropped. A 3-point bishop for a 9-point queen is usually not a problem. There are a few situations where it might be a setup for some sort of mate, but in this case it's not. There's no threats against my king. I don't have to worry about that. So there's nothing tricky here. He just blundered the queen. So bishop takes, and then king takes. And now I'm going to do my pawn on d takes e5. If he doesn't take back with the pawn, then my queen is going to take his pawn. So if his f pawn on f6 there doesn't take my e5 pawn, then it's going to be queen takes. Also, take a look at that d file. It looks like his rook is dominating the d file, but it's not. I control d1, d2, d4, d5, and d6. He only controls really the one he's sitting on, d8, d7, and d3. But if he moves rook to d8 or rook to d3, then I'm just going to play queen takes f6 check, and there should be a mate in the air somewhere. I can feel that mate. So he's probably going to just take with his pawn. When he does, I'll take back with my knight with check and start looking for mate. So he'll play f takes e5, and then I'll play knight takes e5, and that'll be check, and it's time to start hunting a mate. Alright, so I'm going to skewer that king. I'm just going to play the queen to g5 check, and that's a skewer, just to see what he does. And he plays king e6, and I could just take the rook now with my queen and just exchange, pick up the rook for the knight, but I decided to, I guess, try to keep it, but that won't last very long. So he goes, I played knight c6. He's going to play rook d6. And now the knight, remember, he just came from e5, so he is attacking, or rather protecting, that square for me. So I can put my queen on e5 like I did, and that's check, and his king can't take the queen because of the knight. So his king is going to double up the attack on the knight. And then I'm going to move to b8 with check. And the idea is when he puts his king there on c7, my other knight can join the game and fork his king and his rook. So now it's check with my knight on b5, and he's going to take that knight, and then I can start closing in for mate. So king takes b8, so it's going to be queen takes d6 check. And then he doesn't have a ton of options, so he's got king to b7, queen to c7 check. He can't take the queen because the knight is protecting. That's the key when you're attacking a king. Attack a king with a protected piece, because kings can't do anything against protected pieces. All right, now if I played queen takes a7 right now, it would not be mate because he could take the knight. The knight's not protected. Remember, the king can take, he can capture, but he can't take protected pieces. So let's protect it. So the pawn protects the knight, so just playing a4 protects the knight. The rook is protecting the pawn, so we don't have to worry about that. Now, if he does something silly like play, say, h6 here, h5 or h6, then queen takes a7 would just be mate. But since he played king a5, he's trying to get out. He can get out on that b4 square, so we'll stop that. So queen c3 gives check and stops his escape on b4. So now he plays back, his only move. So queen a6, king a6. Now I'm going to move to b4 to stop his king from coming back that way. And he has a choice. He's either going to move his h-pawn or he's going to try to get out with his king. If he tries to get out with his king, it's mate immediately. Same thing with his h-pawn. So if his h-pawn had managed to get itself all the way up to h4, where it couldn't move, and I did something silly like move queen to c7, that would be a stalemate, a draw, because his king wouldn't be in check, but he wouldn't have any legal moves. But fortunately, he has a pawn move left no matter what, and there's a checkmate on the board. You can pause to see if you see it, but it is there. Okay, just pause and see if you see it. I'll give you another look. And now, queen to c8 is checkmate. And queen's attacking the king diagonally. He can't move forward because of the pawns. He can't take the knight because of the pawn. He can't move back diagonally because the queen's still attacking that square. And that game is over. So I hope that you got something from that. Alright, so now we're going to look at how to value the pieces. I talked a little bit in the game about that. And read through this, and this is all from Chess Ultra on my PlayStation 4. Alright, so valuing pieces 1, the capture. By now you will have noticed that the different chess pieces all have different ways of moving. These differences make some pieces more powerful and therefore more valuable than others. This value is measured in pawns. So we use the pawn as the unit of value in chess. And this set here is copper and tin, I think, is the copper and tin set. So you can tell the difference by where the colors are located. So the knight's on one team and all the other pieces are on another team. And what we're going to do here is we're going to take the more valuable piece. The values are as follows. Knight is worth 3 pawns, bishop is worth 3 pawns, rook is worth 5 pawns, queen is worth 9 pawns. The king does not have a value as he is worth the entire game. He's the golden snitch of the game. The value of the pieces, the capture. The values of pieces can be used to inform what moves you should and shouldn't make. Which piece should you take? So if the rook is worth 5 pawns and the knight is worth 3 and the pawn is worth 1, then the knight's going to take the rook for 5 pawns. By the way, we don't keep score. We don't have like I have this many pawns of value. That's not how it works. This is just a rule of thumb. Sometimes you will need to weigh up whether to take an opponent's piece and in return place your attacking piece in danger of being taken. This is called sacrificing. Usually when you sacrifice a piece, though, you're giving it up for some sort of positional or attack advantage. Remember the values of the pieces. The knight is worth 3 pawns, the bishop is worth 3 pawns, the rook is worth 5 pawns, and the queen is worth 9 pawns. So we have a 3-pawn bishop attacking a 5-pawn rook, and we have a 9-pawn queen attacking a 5-pawn rook. Which one should we sacrifice? So the value of the pieces can be used to inform what moves you should and shouldn't make. Obviously, the bishop. Then, if the knight takes the bishop, then the queen can take the knight. All right. Again, we're playing with Chess Ultra here. Alright, so here we're going to talk about notation. Each square of the chessboard is identified by a unique coordinate pair consisting of a letter and a number. The files go up the board and are labeled A through H. So think of filing cabinets. They're the vertical lines. So the files are filing cabinets. So if you look at it, it's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. You can see it right there. And those are called files. The horizontal rows of squares are called ranks and are numbered 1 to 8 starting from white side of the board. So the 1 through 8 is there. You see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And they're ranks because this is a military game. The beauty of this grid-like system is that every square on the board has a name of its own. And because every square has its own name, it is very easy to describe a move. Alright, so if you just look at the board, you can see where A1 is, B2, C9, C9, there's no C9, C8, and so on. Notation, make a move. As well as the squares on the board, the pieces also have notation, except for the pawns. The idea is that if we have a certain number of notations and one is missing, it's the obvious one. Capital B is for bishop, capital R is for rook, capital Q is for queen, capital K is for king, and capital N is for knight. Obviously K is already taken by the king. The pieces have capital letters. When we do the notation for the squares, that's lowercase letters. So we're going to make the move bishop F6, I think. And yeah, bishop F6. Capital B, F6. You notice that the F is notated in the notation with a lowercase, even though it's uppercase on the board itself. But the squares are always noted with lowercase, while the pieces are noted with uppercase. Pawns do not need to have a letter. Capturing pieces is also notated. Capturing a piece is represented by an X, so a little X. So we're going to play the queen takes the pawn, so queen X, and we're going to look where we're at. We are on E5, so queen X E5 is what that's going to ask us to do, or QX E5. So make the move qx e5, or queen takes e5. You can see that the queen can only go that far along that diagonal because the pawn's in the way. So you just play. We'll just play queen takes e5 there. All right. Have a good one.